Okay, good morning. It looks like everybody's here. Let me just say that the economy in California is looking pretty good. Not as good as it's been, but definitely on the mend. But we still have a $10 billion structural deficit and a wall of debt to come. Our finances were plunged into turmoil by the Great Recession and a decade of short-term fixes and fiscal gimmicks. This is not the time to delay or evade. This is the time to put our finances in order. And that's precisely what this May revision intends to do. Because of the increase in revenue, we're reducing the amount of tax extensions that I'm asking for. We're also adopting some very important tax incentives to spur jobs, and I also propose to pay down a substantial amount of the debt that's been built up. I don't want to continue the games and the gimmicks of the past. The total debt that's been built up by these gimmicks is about $34.7 billion. Later on, I'm going to explain exactly what that consists in, and I'll lay out the whole plan. But let's go to the first slide, and you can see where we are. The budget deficit was $26.6 billion in February. It needed today is still $10.8 billion. So when some people come and say, "Hey, you got some more money," we're out of the woods. Untrue. We have a serious structural deficit now and into the future unless we cure it. And the May revision has a remedy that will eliminate that deficit, put California's finance on a strong and honest footing. So let me just show you where we are here. $13.4 billion in serious cuts and other solutions. That's probably the biggest set of reductions that we've ever seen around here that's real. As you remember, well, you'll get to it a little later on. You'll see where before it was just gimmicks. $6.6 billion will be the 2-year increase in new revenues. That's part in the current year, part in the next year. Now, what the year after that, one doesn't know. The budgets, as you look back over 10 years, are more often wrong than they're right. Higher spending, $2 billion. Part of that, most of it, is Proposition 98. It captures the increased revenue and redirects it to schools, which means it's not available for the other 60% of the budget, which involves higher education, public safety, and all the rest. There's also some higher spending in the mental health department and in the corrections that represented unrealistic future cuts that the last administration proposed but were not able to realize. The Prop 10 litigation is now in court. That's going to be held up. It could well go beyond the budget year, so we're not going to count that. The remaining deficit, 9.6, put in 1.2 reserve, which is, I think, prudent, and there's where you have it. Let's take the next slide and give it more graphic. We started with 26.6. You see approximately $20 billion over the next 3 years. We've got half the job done, but we're still looking at essentially a $10 billion structural deficit, and that's what we want to deal with. Let's take the next slide. This assumes the extension of the taxes. Okay, assuming that the legislature and the voters approve, we get the tax extensions that I'm asking for. Still, the spending goes all the way back here to the time of Governor Reagan. So spending in relationship to per capita income is definitely one of the lowest points in 4 decades. Now, let me give you just some key changes to the May revision. That's the next slide. The revenue gain is 6.6. I know you're going to focus on that, but we've taken almost half of it and reduced the tax package. That's income tax and the enterprise zone tax break. We modify that to give the taxpayers a break. Required public education spending, 1.6. Prop 10 litigation, we take out $1 billion, canceling we reduce our borrowing. And that's really a big part of the story, reducing the wall of debt. And then other changes, $400 million, that's in corrections and the mental health. Built up, again, gimmicks. A year ago they said they're going to get that. They couldn't get it. So-called unallocated costs. Now, if you add that up, it's a little more than $5 billion. If we don't get to abolish redevelopment, that adds another $1.7 billion, and that takes us eats up the $6.6 billion and more. So that's the May revision. Now, what's the goal here? What are we trying to achieve? Let's go to the next slide. We want to eliminate 43 boards and commissions. There'll be more to come, but we lay out in the materials that I gave you the elimination of those boards. We cut out 5,500 state positions, and we dropped general fund spending back to 72-73. And maybe bring back slide 3, because I just like to emphasize where we were here. Yeah, slide 3. So we're back to 72. That's where we are. So when people say we're spending too much money, we're relative to the wealth, this is where we are. I might say, by the way, for those critics of California who say California's a failed state, people are all moving to Texas, the fact is this year the increase in our collective personal income will be $75 billion. And if you divide that by the number of people, it's about $2,000 per person. And we'll get the same amount next year. So any state that can generate $4,000 per person is a very powerful state indeed. That's why we are the 8th or 9th largest political entity in the world. Let's go now to slide 6. Next thing we do, besides cut, we want to restore education spending. We go to 52.4. That's about $3 billion more than I expected in January. But go back there to 2007, 2008, when we were writing the big mortgage bubble, schools were getting a lot more money. And we haven't, it's going to take us a number of years to get there. But this is a very solid result for repairing our schools. Let's go to the next slide. We also now want to deal with the real economy. So I change the enterprise zones, or I propose to give enterprise zone credits to new jobs only. There are consultants that go tell businesses that have already hired people, maybe a year before, that you can get a tax credit from the state. So the tax credit did not provide any stimulus, but merely paid people for doing what they're already going to do. So we want to modify the enterprise zone proposal and focus it on new jobs, and we think if we do that, that will encourage new jobs. It will also recapture about $130 million of what would have been almost $1 billion tax elimination. Encourage investments in California through mandatory single sales. That again was a tax break that I want to eliminate. In-state businesses have to pay a single sales according to a mandatory formula. Other out-of-state located companies can pick their own. It's unfair. It's a competitive disadvantage to California companies. And we think if we restrict the single sales tax incentive or tax methodology to those who create jobs in California, it will stimulate jobs. Then third, we take some of the savings from the single sales tax credit, because it is $1 billion saving, and we plow it into eliminating a certain amount of the sales tax on equipment purchases. This is something that manufacturers have long wanted, and we put that in as a spur to manufacturing jobs. And then finally, there's a hiring tax credit, which is different than the enterprise zone. It's not really been very effective, and we change it by increasing eligibility in a way that will make it more usable, and therefore we think will stimulate more jobs. All right, next slide, please. This is just to remind everybody of what the previous approach to budgeting was. That's what we mean by smoke and mirrors and gimmicks. There was lots of talk about a $60 billion budget cut. 84% of it was one-time or illusory. It didn't really come to be. So that's the kind of gimmickry that then builds up financial obligations. Because when I say gimmick, it's a form of borrowing from the future. And you keep piling that up, and you weaken our finances. You take money away from solid programs because you don't face the music. All right, let's take the next slide.